One. And this is the SPS talk show live at Hamilton Prop House with a really, really special guest that I'm so honored to have on and cannot believe said yes to me. Andrew McLUHAN,
I've
grandson of
I've yet to
grandson of,
say no to you, Sean. So
well, that's not true. You said no to me once.
okay, we won't talk about that.
And how dare you interrupt such a positive introduction?
Oh, forgive me. I'll continue.
I'm just kidding. Andrew McLUHAN is the grandson of Marshall McLuhan. He is in charge of the Marshall McLuhan Institute, and he probes vigorously all things related to media, language, culture, and technology on X, amongst other places. He has a Substack. We're going to get into all of that. Andrew, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm realizing that I need to up my podcast setting game because you are obviously killing it in that respect.
Thank you.
I'm now going to see if I can arrange a deal with my favorite local cocktail bar to see if they'll let me have access to their place in the daytime to do this stuff because I need more vibes.
Okay, so I said before, I guess I will say again, we are at Hamilton Prop House. It's on Barton Street in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Everyone who designs sets for the many local productions around here gets their accoutrement from this place. I am currently sitting in the train car. It is a Mad Men moment, but we have Edwardian moments over there, Victorian moments over there, tens of thousands of books, and that's on top of a bar, a cafe, a performance venue. I'm having a sea salt cortado right now.
Oh,
And just to make it impossible for you to be resisted, why don't you sneak preview for us the name of your proposed venue?
well, I'll have to pick. We do have an embarrassment of riches here in Picton, Prince Edward County, Ontario, Canada, the world. We have two excellent cocktail bars. The one in Picton is called the Russ & Co. And it will transport you to anywhere in the world, like New York City or Tokyo or San Francisco, that has a classic cocktail bar. It's just what you want. And it is situated within Picton's historic Regent Theater, begun as a vaudeville house, converted to film, now to digital, and whatever else they do there. They're in the lobby of that, which is excellent. But then they also have a sister bar in Wellington, Prince Edward County, Ontario, Canada, called Bar Duchess, which is equally majestic and glorious. So I do happen to I've got a relationship with them because I have something they want, and now they have something other than cocktails that I want. One thing you may not know about me, Sean Patrick Sullivan, is that I am a micro maple syrup producer.
Are you serious?
Why would I lie about that? I'm very serious.
Maple syrup is so rich in minerals and delicious.
It is
for so many different things.
such a beautiful, simple thing, and it's just about the only, my son Virgil calls our place the word farm, which is wonderful. I do consider myself a worm farmer and tender. But we also have these two giant old sugar maples, and for the last few years, I've been tapping them maples and making the syrup. And why the cocktail bar cares is because I do it on an open fire, which smoke gets into it, so it's a smoky maple syrup, which makes it excellent for cocktails.
Wow. So do you sell this through retail or a website or anything,
I
or
don't sell
this
it.
is just something? Okay.
No, if you want it, you have to come visit. We make a small amount. It ends up being 8 or 10 liters, which is enough for the family and to give some to friends and to slip a couple bottles to the cocktail bar.
That is awesome.
Yeah. In fact,
And you've been doing
second place at the county fair last year for our maple syrup. Yeah.
so so you're in Picton. What's life like there? I've never visited.
Shame. Shame on you. I'm surprised.
You could always invite me.
Well, please come visit, Sean. Um,
Okay.
it's Prince Edward County, which was apparently unironically called Toronto's Hamptons a little while ago by one of the local major papers. Um, it's uh, it's a tourist area which has slowly been turning into kind of East Queen Street East. Over
Okay.
the years, gone considerably more westward since the Drake moved into Wellington some years ago. Um, but gentrification's not all bad. Sure, you can't afford to live here anymore, but we do have cocktail bars, so that's something.
I think gentrification is an amazing thing, and I'm going to tell you why. It reveals to the world who the actual artists and innovators are.
Sure.
I'll tell you why. The frauds, the charlatans, the posers sit and complain saying that things are getting too expensive while asking the government for some sort of handout to maintain the arts, which you never want to do with the arts government funding. It's an invitation to censorship. But what the true innovators do is they go to the most unexpected places ever and they make wonderful things happen. And I'm currently very inspired not only by the Renaissance in Hamilton, which, there's still a lot to get beyond in terms of crack and whatnot, but we'll do it. And but there's also Pittsburgh and so many other places where one would not expect there to be a richness of creative energy, and yet there is. I don't know if you agree or not.
I find very little to disagree with there. It's nice to hear. You're known for your loosely held, uncontroversial opinions, and you continue that tradition, which I'm delighted to hear.
Thank you. So, for my viewers and listeners who don't know you, as I said before, you're the grandson of Marshall McLuhan. You are the founder, correct? As well as the chief operating officer of the McLuhan Institute.
Correct. Not the Marshall McLuhan Institute.
Okay.
That's not
The McLuhan Institute,
yeah.
which is themcluhaninstitute.com, and that's MC, not MAC.
Correct.
And what's the McLuhan Institute?
That's a good question. Mainly it's hopes and dreams held together by spit, clouds, and rainbows. It's an idea that's solidifying. When I began it in 2017 or so, it was more dream than reality. It's become uh, quite real, which is remarkable. Actually, it's an experiment born of necessity. I looked around and I saw that a McLuhan Institute didn't exist. A McLuhan Center for Culture and Technology existed only in name, really. And I felt that something needed to exist that would be an organization point, a place to preserve and continue this tradition of media studies and investigation and exploration, which was started by my grandfather, continued by my father for many years. Um, and I realized when he died, there was nothing in place to carry on, and I felt that that was a problem. So, looking around and seeing nobody else who was going to do it, I decided it would have to be me. And I kind of I took a bit of a chance on it. It was an experiment to see if such a thing could be sustainable and succeed. And at this point, 10 years or so later, I'd say I'm almost at sustainable. So that's pretty good progress.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
Now for those dummies who don't know who Marshall McLuhan was, he is, in my opinion, and I don't want any challenges on the subject, the single most important intellectual force of the 20th century. He is considered by many to be part of the larger Toronto school, which also included Northrop Frye and Walter Ong. Some people agree with that, some people don't. I would also place him in a cultural moment with, oh my goodness, who wrote Future Shock? Alvin Toffler.
Huh?
He had a background. By the way, what I'm doing right now is I'm volunteering for an oral exam because you're going to correct me if I get anything wrong. He was born in Canada,
Correct.
educated at Cambridge,
Among other places.
like
Well, University of Winnipeg, Manitoba, that is, in Winnipeg. But you know, he won a scholarship to Cambridge, and to show his uh, Canadian grit and determination. You know, this was in the Depression, and they didn't have any money, so he got the scholarship. But then he had to get to England, so he and his buddy Tom Easterbrook made their way to the East Coast and then worked their passage across to England with their bikes on a cattle boat, which
I didn't know that.
yeah, I can imagine it's probably one of the most unpleasant ways to travel that you can imagine is over the Atlantic, shoveling cow crap across the sea as you go.
Wow.
So yeah, he arrived in England smelling like cow crap, and they told him that his degrees from Canada didn't count. So he had to redo his bachelor's and master's before they would let him do the PhD that he had won the scholarship for.
In English literature?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
And so tell me what happened next. Let's flesh out this story. So he's studying English literature. Does he immediately come back to Canada, or
No, because there was no work in Canada. Funny how things don't change. I realized after doing my taxes that just about 99% of my work last year was through the United States.
yes?
So, you know, he got a job teaching English in the US. Um, Discovered that he had no idea who these kids were and what made them tick, what they were about. So he did something revolutionary, which was he took the skills he'd learned for studying literature, uh, literary criticism, and turned them toward popular culture, advertising, comics, sport, these kinds of things. And to everybody's surprise, learned a lot. That resulted in his first book, The Mechanical Bride, Folklore of Industrial Man. From there, he taught at St. Louis University for several years, and my father was born there before finally getting back to Canada in 44, 45, at Assumption University in Windsor, and then University of Toronto in 46, where he taught for the rest of his career.
Now, how was this tilt towards popular culture and the emerging electric media? It wasn't electronic yet. Uh, how was that received by certain others?
Well, mixed reviews. Uh, those who got it loved it. Those who didn't hate it. Maybe I'm oversimplifying, but it seems to me that most of the people who didn't like his work didn't really get it. Um, maybe that's my own bias. I don't know, but
Well, I'm going to give you my interpretation. You tell me what you think of it.
sure.
Your grandfather was on a certain level, a very human level, horrified about everything technologically that happened after the invention of the light bulb. And that horror has been confirmed by everything from sociology to anthropology to the science and medicine of circadian rhythms.
Hmm.
On the other hand, he was, despite his own tastes, despite his own wishes. He had no arrogance whatsoever. And as a voyager, an intellectual, someone who is passionate about ideas and stories and humanity, he probed relentlessly. And this confused people because how do you speak in such glorious, almost 19th century philological terms about pop trash? I think that the irony in his work, the comedy in his work, the one-liners like, I'm so glad to be on the CBC, which is so good at producing programming nobody wants to see on live television." I know I didn't get that exactly, but I hope it's close enough. And what first drew me to his work long before I ever knew you existed and had met you and been charmed by you is that his work itself is such an incredible performance. And I really don't think that, without him, there would be no Camille Paglia, who does something similar in her work and has credited him so vigorously in so many of her interviews and lectures.
Yep.
Thought?
Uh,
How am I doing?
You're doing fine. You know what? Most people miss the performative aspect. And some people catch it, and that's why they don't like him. That is one of the reasons why he ruffled a lot of academic feathers, because that's not how a serious scholar comports oneself. You know,
Which is strange because the output was so literary. I mean, when I read it, I feel the whispers and the influences of Joyce, but a lot of theoretical writers are so dreary that they never actually develop a writing style unless you're Judith Butler, in which case style is let's make sentences that are 3 pages long and say nothing.
my mom's enjoying this, by the way.
Oh, is she?
Yeah.
Hi, Mom.
Yeah, she's waving. But this Marshall McLuhan was such a deliberate person. He was also a high octane intellectual. He burned hot and fast, and he could talk and reason and think circles around most people.
Yes.
Regularly did, as your comment about the CBC shows. He wasn't
It's still true.
it's still true. You know nothing of my work. You mean my whole fallacy is wrong, right? But he in a moment of high revelation, he said, I see no point in making anything but controversial statements. There's no other way to get people's attention. Which tells you a lot. It tells you a lot about what he was trying to do, which was to get people's attention. Big distinction between what he was doing and what people do today is he wasn't trying to get people's attention for the sake of getting attention, for the sake of building a brand or a personal profile. He had an object, which was he understood that for human history, we've been blindsided, somewhat, participationally blindsided by the effects of our technologies. And, we needed to be woken up. He wrote a wonderful letter to EZRA Pound, and I think it was early 50s, maybe it was 51. He said to him, "I'm an intellectual thug who has been slowly accumulating an arsenal with every intention of using it in order to needle the somnambulists," is what he said. He's poking and prodding people and trying to wake them TF up to what's going on around him. And he would say in exasperation later, "I'm the only one who knows what's going on." He said in Understanding Media, "I'm in the position of Louis Pasteur, trying to tell everybody that their greatest enemy is everywhere around them, invisible, unseen." He said, you pull the fire alarm and people think you started the fire. but that wasn't the case. But one of the pleasures in studying his work, and not just his written output and the substance of his work, but the way he delivered it. One of the great pleasures is his style and the joy he had in playing, playing the game. He knew he was on television. He knew he was on radio. He knew he was being interviewed, and he had fun with it. He was able to do this for a few reasons. One of them being his mother. His mother, Elsie Naomi Hall, was an elocutionist. She was a performer. Back in early 20th century, they moved to Winnipeg from Edmonton, where Marshall was born, because Edmonton was um, one of the performance centers of North America and a railway hub. It wasn't the backwater. Well, it's more of a backwater today, but it was more of a happening place back then. And she used to deliver dramatic monologues and poetry and stuff in church basements and concert halls, vaudeville halls, things like this. And my grandfather certainly caught a lot of his performative ability and flair from his mother and father, who was well known as a sort of great storyteller and guy who liked to have a joke and a good time. So, Marshall came by these things very honestly, as we say. And I think he's yet to be appreciated for the style of his engagement with his work. But I think that's a huge part of what he did and who he was.
Well, I'm almost done with the first draft of my first book.
Oh, congratulations.
It's it's 100 essays on everything that interests me.
Wow.
It's it's running about 1,000 pages. I invoke your grandfather constantly. I go back and forth between no one understands him quite like I do, and I have no idea what I'm talking about. I'm so confused.
Okay.
And um, the reason that I keep going back to him is he's perpetually useful. And he makes the process of consuming and producing mass media artifacts, essays, interviews, everything much more lively. It's almost as if his presence is one that is primarily electrifying, whereas the post-structuralists, the neo-Marxists, the other contemporary Satanists of the current academic cabal produce such dreary, um, uh, um, uh, damp, wet blanket unified field theories of oppression and manipulation that there's no real point in critiquing any text because it's just assumed that what's encoded is decoded. I guess I kind of went into Stuart Hall for a moment, and that's all that there is to it. So one of the things that I'm curious about, and we're deviating from the agenda that I sent you a bit, but don't worry, I promise we'll get to everything, including your remarkable accomplishments, is there was, he had a profound talent for prophecy, a tapping into the collective consciousness or the field of morphic resonance, as Rupert Sheldrake would say, um, that very, very, very few intellectuals, public or otherwise, have ever been able to achieve. Foreseeing the internet, foreseeing the effects of the internet in terms of broadening the scope of what we consume, but also making it far more shallow. And I'm wondering if you would like to talk for a little bit about his uniquely prophetic um, capacity.
Sure. Um, he was always having fun, and was, I think, always true to his own lineage, which his forefathers were people like, well, I suppose you could probably say James Joyce was his father. Uh,
Yes.
James Joyce called himself the greatest engineer of the 20th century, or did he call himself the greatest engineer who ever lived? Um, One or the other, but Marshall concurred. Um, and this was another thing that upset the serious academics, um, because he took Joyce very, very seriously. If you look across his work, Joyce and Finnegan's Wake are most are who are most in what are most cited, I believe, in his own work, and that troubles people with cause. But the sense of play,
Why? Explain that.
well, because Joyce is incomprehensible to most people. Uh, if you look at Finnegan's Wake, it it's difficult to get into it. People have a hard time with it, myself included. I'm not trained in literary criticism by any means, and I've yet to really dive as deeply into Joyce as I could, if not should. But Joyce was a master of language, and he, uh, like Marshall, was able to pack so much into so little, when it comes to words. There's a richness and economy, that is really startling. I mean, you know what? And I try to emulate that, because words are my thing. I'm a poet. And what did I put? I threw out a tweet. Twitter is my playground for words. And I threw out a tweet a couple days ago, something about, I've been wandering 40 years in the desert. And somebody, who obviously doesn't know me or my family's work, commented on how, that was actually a great typo. And I said that, the pun is always intentional. That was no typo, But that was something that was hard to take for people because it's not serious scholarship. But I wander. Speaking of wandering in the desert, I wandered a little bit astray from what was your question, Sean?
So that's fine. That's fine because what you said
Oh, no,
was,
no, prophecy. Let me get to that. Sorry. Okay, because this is important. On the one hand, Marshall said, "I'm very careful to only predict things which have already happened." Okay, and he,
hold on. Let's
yeah,
have people meditate on that for a
yeah,
moment. Say it again.
yeah. I'm very careful to only predict things which have already happened. He meant this seriously on the one hand, because he believed that people live decades behind the present, that we actually live perceptually in the past, uh, because the world changes under our feet a long while before we notice it. We just keep going on
Yes.
our merry way. Um, so a part of what he's saying in that statement is that a lot of what looks to us like prediction is his description of the present, of his present. And if that today, if we can look around and say, wow, the internet, wow, AI, I get it now. I get what he was talking about. Well, it should give you some pause that he was describing his present, a present that was over 50 years ago. That should cause you some discomfort. It does for me, um, because I think, wow, what am I missing right now? That literally does keep me up some nights, and actually is a large reason why I do what I do,
Yes.
which is Um, as you say, the reason McLuhan's work persists is because it's useful. And a
Yes.
large part of what I try to do is pick out and make plain the utility, the useful bits, and make them available and accessible for people because we need them. The further we get down this vortex, the more deeply we need them. But there's another part to this prediction piece, and that is the artistic part. So, a through line in Marshall McLuhan's work is his emphasis on the arts and the artist, capital A's. And this comes uh, this comes from a remark of Ezra Pound, not Edgar Poe, the other EP, from an amazing little book from I think it was 1931, The ABC of Reading. Lovely little book. Have you read it, Sean? Do you have it?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Well, you must. Uh, easy to
What's the title again?
ABC of Reading. Easy to find and get a copy of for like, $10 or whatever. Small little book. But he remarks in this book that the artist is the antenna of the race. And this little statement, Marshall turned into a pillar of his work, if not a cornerstone or a foundation, whichever metaphor you choose to use. But Marshall developed this and spoke of the artist as the dew line, the distant early warning line. And he evoked this metaphor in the 60s because people were familiar with the dew line, which was a series of radar installations across the Canadian Arctic set up by the US and Canada in order to warn, to give Washington 6 minutes before the Russian nukes obliterated them, right? Distant early warning. Marshall saw artists as the dew line, the radar, the canary in the coal mine. And he used them in this way. And his reasoning or theory about this, although he protested he didn't have any theories, his reasoning was that it all has to come down to his core understanding of the effects of technology and how they actually shape us in culture. And that is on a sensory level. Human beings, I like to say that we are the sum of our senses, right? Our senses are various and we have many senses, including a sense of humor, more or less developed in some people. But all our senses are individual and collective. They're individual, but they also work as a whole. They exist in a balance and a ratio among each other. And when you change, they're in a self-contained environment. And like an environment, when you change one part of it, you change the whole thing. When it comes to humans, small changes in our senses can mean large changes in our being and our identity. The reason why artists are different is because artists tend to be people who, while the rest of us, our senses kind of dull through misuse and inattention, artists are constantly sharpening their senses because they want to experience novel things and they make it their business to be a bridge between experience and expression. And so they experience these things like the missiles coming over the horizon, and they express them like radar images to the rest of us, whether or not we pay attention. And it's important to note that the artist doesn't, just like the radar box, doesn't necessarily understand the signals. It's broadcasting them. It's up to us to understand. And that's a critical point. But Marshall used this for all it was worth because he understood that changes in the arts reflect changes in the environment. And these changes come faster than we notice. A great example of this is how the art of any period tends to be utterly foreign, controversial, ridiculous, unpalatable to most people. I like to use the example of Elvis. because today it's hard to imagine a more, kind of benign figure than Elvis Presley. But at the time, he was controversial, very shocking. Parents didn't want their daughters listening to that and watching that man swing his hips on stage. Um, but this is case in point that the art of the time is shocking and controversial because it's reflecting change that is shocking and controversial, which will later become benign as it ekes out into society. So so this prediction piece, it's funny because Marshall is actually the artist that he's claiming is important in society. Although he never admits it really, but that's what he is. So what looks like prophecy is actually kind of advanced warning and not necessarily a message from the future, but a message to the present.
So, so there, Marshall McLuhan was operating as an artist without taking on the title. And here we are today with a variety of artists in a variety of forms, irritatingly and drearily droning on and on and on about personal expression and political activism, which for me scrambles the signal or prevents it from being received and projected. One of my favorite celebrity interview quotes is from Madonna, who, when asked for the meaning behind one of her songs, "You'll Have to Forgive Me, but I don't remember which," said, "Who cares what I think? And who knows?" And she said, "And you're assuming I know what I'm putting out there."
Yeah, this is excellent. This is T.S. Eliot, whether Madonna knows it or not, who said, "A poem can't mean something it doesn't mean to you."
Yes. So let's talk about this for just a moment.
Sure.
Um, what is the state of the artist today? It's not to say that there isn't great art happening. Of course there is. But the profit motive, the banality, the technological ease with which people can produce and circulate work. Do you have any comments or probes in that area?
Yes. Um, it's funny you say profit motive, because I hear different definitions or spellings of the word profit. Of
Prophet.
right.
Now, don't get me wrong. I think that if one is receiving messages and is passionate about putting them out there, it's incumbent upon them to be as financially successful as possible so that those messages can be developed with the greatest amount of resources and effort. But there's a difference between being driven by your work and being driven by your career. They're two different things.
Well, uh, the worst thing to ever happen to art was the art industry,
Yes.
and Granddad makes this point again in Understanding Media, which actually could be and should be read as Media Ecology's art manifesto. Uh,
So tell us about the book and then go on about what is said.
well, chapter 7 in particular is all about the arts and how we can use the arts as forecasting tools. Um, you know, art as clear instruction on how to avoid, he calls it the bully blow of innovation of technology. Um, uh, the artist, he follows in Pound and Wyndham Lewis's footsteps in talking about artists in this manner. A lot of what Marshall did was really throw amplification and some slight modification behind other people's ideas. Um, in some cases, he broadcast them. In other cases, he put them in a new light, which, uh, you know, usually the original person did not intend and did not thank him for, but Marshall found it useful, so what the hell? Um, but uh, he even says this week, I've been teaching this course on understanding media where every week I read a chapter out loud and discuss it and talk about where it comes from and what he means by it and everything. And it's a few hours every week. It takes 18 months to go through the whole thing, a chapter a week. And this last week, we were reading chapter 24, Games, the Extensions of Man. And he brings back some of the art talk, and he mentions how the worst thing to happen to art is the commercialization of it. The worst thing we can do to artists is make celebrities of them. Um, the art schools can be useful, but where they're destructive is that the art industry, any business likes continuity and predictability, right? Um, Innovation isn't all that predictable. They like the safe bet. Hollywood shows this every time they put out a new Marvel movie, or any movie, which they've really done 20 times before and have just put out under a slightly new skin, right? Um, but in order for art to fulfill its warning function, its utility function, it needs to be new. But art schools tend to push people to develop their style, right? Singular, their unique style. And then to push out work after work after work after work after work, as long as the public is willing to buy it, right? So they create both an appetite and the produce to fill it. But this is the death of art, because there's no novelty in that. The world moves on, yet you're stuck in this style and structure. And there might be something said for it, but it's not news. Another thing Pound said in that book is that poetry is news that stays news. And I kind of love that quote. But understanding media, I'll give you the hot tip, quick rundown of understanding media. Um, it is what it says it is, and a guide to understanding media, um, not understanding the media of 1964, but understanding human innovation. This is why it remains relevant. And the way, if you look at the book structurally, it's two parts. Part one is 7 chapters, and I think of these as McLuhan's 7 liberal arts. Um, Part two is 26 chapters, uh, deliberately meant to draw attention to the phonetic alphabet, which is, the ground of the book. It's a whole bunch of letters, right? Um, well, part one, these 7 chapters, I read as different approaches, general principles of technology, of culture and technology, and the reciprocal relationship between the two. They're different ways of understanding media. Part two, the 26 chapters, take these methods or tools from part one and apply them to specific technologies, from the spoken and written word to the telephone and telegraph, television, to housing and clothing, which are not things which were thought of as communication studies, because they're not, they're media studies. And finally, to automation, the final chapter, 33, automation, is very important to read today, as we're kind of living it out in front of our eyes. But this is how I approach understanding media as a work of poetry. Um, if you approach it that way, you get more from it because you expect to give more to it. You expect to work when you read a poem, to study,
Um,
to try it on. Yeah, Sean, what?
no, I'm so sorry. Please keep going.
Well, I'll just finish up by mentioning that um, if you approach it as a book of poetry rather than as a textbook, you'll get more from it because, well, it was written that way. It actually began as a textbook and was rewritten and rewritten in order to take out associations and to make other associations and create more poetic language, to force the reader, if they want to get something from it, to engage with it. Like a poem. You know, you try it on with different voices and you think about words and you look up words and you look for resonance and relevance. Um, and if you follow that, you'll get a lot more from it. And if you try to treat it like a textbook, well, you'll be and people are very disappointed.
So so first of all, something just came to me.
Okay.
In your own writing, you often shorthand your grandfather's name MML.
Okay.
And the shorthand for the way that most people interact with artificial intelligence is LLM.
Huh?
And if we think about the Kabbalistic view of the nature of reality, the nature of words, and the function of letters, there's something to be said for the inversion between the two. I don't know if you want to comment on that or if I should just go on about understanding media.
Let's go on. I think that's fun. I usually shorthand it to MM. I don't often.
Oh, well, that kind of destroys what I just said, Andrew.
Well, sorry.
I'm sorry.
I I
I'm sorry.
I
Maybe you could start doing MM.
I respect you too much to take it easy on you.
Okay. Um, correct me if I'm wrong, Understanding Media was the book with the chapter on money. Now, for people who are unfamiliar with MML's work, there's this idea that men make technologies, then technologies make men over. There's this related idea that everything that we invent is an extension of ourselves. So, apparel or fashion is an extension of skin. Cameras are extensions of eyes. Chairs are extensions of the buttocks, controversially. And this went on and on and on in ways of describing all sorts of devices and technologies. I found the most profound, powerful, confusing, infuriating, I don't know if I said this yet, poetic chapter was the one on money, which was described controversially as a extension of love.
Oh.
And am I correct? Is this my imagination? I did have a 5-year long downward spiral, Andrew. I was in a nut house for a while. I may be making this up.
Well, I wondered. I hadn't heard from you for a while, Sean.
Okay. Okay, so
And forgive
we'll
me,
talk
but
we'll talk about that in a moment, but what? What?
I said forgive me, but it doesn't come as a complete surprise.
No, it doesn't.
Wait.
So 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 when I read that essay, I was immediately reminded of, do you know the economist Milton Friedman?
I know the name.
So Milton Friedman was America's most cuddly and adorable uncle or grandpa of an economist. At one point appearing on late night talk shows, he was a libertarian capitalist. And there's this wonderful 3-minute video on YouTube in which he talks about pencils. This is a pen, this is a fountain pen, but it's going to be proxy for a pencil. And it talks about how between the manufacturing, the sourcing, the distribution, and the use of the pencil, it's an example of people from all over the world who otherwise, thank you, people who all over the world would not get along in a barter system, would have no way of collaborating, but are able to, in the represented by this pencil, are able to collaborate through commerce. And there's such resonance between those two ideas, which I think, were recorded and written around the same time. But you've never seen that, so anyway.
I do
Um,
love pencils, however, and if I can give a shout out, uh,
please do.
you know, I've been actually angling. You know how they skateboard companies will sponsor a skateboard. I've been trying to get this pencil company to sponsor me. Maybe this will work. This is the Blackwing Palomino. Oop, upside down. Blackwing Palomino. By the way, personal bone to pick. Most people don't realize that most pencils are right-handed. Pencils and pens, for that matter. Because if you look at it, you can only read it if you're holding it in your right hand. If you're holding it in your left hand, it's backwards.
Okay.
Mm,
Are you left-handed?
I am. So
Okay.
yeah.
Burned at the stake.
Anyway, Blackwing, these are they're kind of bougie, like they're expensive, but they are my pencil of choice. They say half the pressure, twice the speed. It's a lovely instrument, this Blackwing Palomino pencil. I'm trying to get them to do a collab with me and the McLuhan Institute, but they're not answering my emails.
How dare they?
How
What's the company called again?
Blackwing,
Blackwing Hair. How dare you? Contact Andrew McLuhan immediately.
right?
This is going to be the collaboration of the century.
I do love
So,
their pencils, though.
I noticed that there's something special about the tip or the eraser.
It has a very distinctive ferrule, I believe it's called, that, the kind of pinched look, and it pulls out and you can replace it if you use I actually find myself that I wear the pencil down before I wear the eraser down, but it's my weapon of choice for annotation and marginalia, because of course I write in my books. That's what they're for. Do you mark your books, Sean?
So here's the thing. I am conflicted. I want to,
Okay.
but I'm not always happy with my handwriting. Even though it's wonderful, it's like comic book lettering, but still. So what I will often do is photocopy or print and then notate vigorously on that.
Okay. Well, I
So
invite you to take the plunge. Well, that's what the white space is there for a reason.
yes. Do you so let's get through some random notes before we tackle religion and mysticism.
Okay.
So something that's astonishing about Marshall McLuhan's career is that he may have been the first publisher of a zine.
Interesting.
The Do Line. It was very punk rock. I mean, it looked punk rock. To contemporary eyes, Hamilton has a big punk scene. There are posters all over the place for shows 4 or 5 days a week.
I love that.
And the Do Line, which was self-published, I don't really know the background of it anymore, I don't remember, looked like that. So please talk about that for a moment.
Yeah. Well, you're referring to the Do Line newsletter of the late 1960s? Yeah. Okay. This, in fact, was a highly produced arrangement. Not really so much a zine, but what it was a good idea. And it came about, so Understanding Media came out in 1964, and by 1965, 1966, Marshall McLuhan was a household name. This, curiously, was not an accident, but design, and was largely, all credit does not go to, but a large amount of credit goes to this fascinating figure, Howard Luck Gossage, as a matter of fact, who was a San Francisco ad guy, who had a penchant for humanitarian causes, and his partner was a man named Jerry Fagan, who apparently was a amateur ventriloquist, but professional proctologist, which is the most delightful mix you can imagine. and leads, the stuff writes itself. That's all you have to say, really. But Jerry saw this book, Understanding Media, when it came out, gave it to his partner and said, not really my thing, but I think you'll love this. And he was right. Howard Gossage, who was, they called him the Socrates of San Francisco. He was known to be very innovative and cutting edge and philosophical. He read it and he was like, oh my God, the world needs to know this guy, and I'm going to make it my business for that to happen. He calls up Marshall McLuhan and he says, Dr. McLuhan, how would you like to be famous? This happened. His wife in her memoir relates this story. And I can imagine the other half of the conversation, my grandfather saying, well, sure, that sounds like a good idea. Let's do it. But what happens is Howard spends a couple $1,000s of his own money, brings Marshall McLuhan to New York City on a PR blitz, hosts dinner parties and cocktail hours with people like Tom Wolfe and the intelligentsia and literati of the day. Then follows that up a few months later with a Marshall McLuhan Festival in the summer of 1965 in San Francisco. And in the fall of 1965, all these articles in newspaper start to come out about Marshall McLuhan. And for the next few years, he's all over. And it's because Howard Gossage decided to do a deliberate PR campaign and elevate this guy to the world. Now, that's a fascinating historical example of intentional virality. And whereas some people were famous for being famous, that wasn't enough back then. The key ingredient, what made it work, was Marshall McLuhan, who caught the attention and the imagination and fascination of people and was actually somebody worth writing and talking about back then. He still is today. But where I'm going with this is partly as a result of this, Marshall McLuhan was awarded the Albert Schweitzer Chair of the Humanities at Fordham University for the 1967-1968, or was it 66-67 academic year. He got a leave from the University of Toronto and went down and taught at Fordham. That chair came with $100,000, which was a huge amount of money back then. And Marshall used a portion of those funds, a large portion, to bring with him 4 key people. Edmund Carpenter, which a new book just came out about Edmund Carpenter by Richard Cavell, which is worth getting. I think it's called Anthropology Upside Down. Wonderful little book. Edmund Carpenter in anthropology, the guy with whom Marshall began the Explorations Journal back in the 40s, 50s. George Thompson, his assistant at the time. ERiC McLUHAN, my father, who had begun working with Marshall, and Harley Parker. Parker, part of this Toronto school you mentioned, was a museum exhibition guy at the Royal Ontario Museum. Did something fascinating called the Hall of Fossils, which they really should dig out of whatever basement they buried it in, because it's an amazing thing I would love to see. Harley Parker was a painter, an artist, who at the time became kind of mini McLuhan. From what I understand, when Marshall became too busy to take speaking gigs and stuff, he would say, oh, well, I'm too busy for that, but you should get my guy Harley Parker to come talk to you because he's familiar with my stuff and good fun and whatever. Anyway, and as a result of this year in New York City, which I think there is a book that needs to be written about McLuhan in New York in that period and his effect on New York in that period. Parts of it are coming out, but one thing that was a result was he met this guy, Eugene Schwartz. Not to be confused with another guy he met down there, Tony Schwartz. Tony Schwartz is a fascinating figure, and we could talk probably for a long time about him, but Eugene Schwartz was another ad guy, um, ran something called the Human Development Corporation, and it was his idea to do McLuhan for business people, which resulted in the McLuhan Dewline newsletter. The McLuhan Dewline newsletter ran for just over 2 years, and is a fascinating artifact. When you look at it, and if you want to make your way to Toronto and go to the John Kelly Library at University of Toronto, you can. They have, I believe, an almost complete collection of the Dewline newsletter, 2.5 volumes of it, and it starts out. It's so deliberate in its style. It starts out as a black and white newsprint thing and moves through to a high graphic production thing with cutouts and a card deck and a flexi disc and typography and all this stuff. Um, a fascinating artifact that didn't catch on. It kind of died out, unfortunately.
Well, I think that's because it was so ahead of its time. When I said zine, I didn't mean the cheap throwaway ones. I meant the ones that are developed by small collectives for very specific reasons that have a really sophisticated yet artisanal or handcrafted look about them that operate not just as repositories of information, but an experience to behold and read.
Yeah, and this is definitely that. It's again, this is a story to be told. One of my projects, I have so many projects to do with the McLuhan Institute, projects that are just waiting for funding, essentially. And this is one of them. What I would love to do is I would love to reissue the Dewline newsletter in its original form and cadence. So as a subscription format, one-to-one production, one-to-one timeline. So we would start in like January 2026, and it would be a monthly mail out that is identical to the original. But it's no small order. I've crunched the numbers a little bit. So the Dewline newsletter, when it came out, was a $50 annual subscription. That equals around $600 today. And that might do it. That might be about what it takes to do it. It would be a very expensive undertaking. But there's so much, that stuff has never really been reprinted. And it's a very interesting expression of Marshall McLuhan's ideas, directed toward the business community in particular. And as such, it's a really fascinating kind of expression, as well as being a wonderful example of design and typography and these things of the time. So if anybody out there is listening and wants to be part of that, it's a big commitment. It's a minimum 3-year project to do it, and would require quite a bit of startup capital. And then people would have to subscribe. The advantage we have in doing it now is we know the scope of it. We know it begins in, on this date and ends on this date. So we can say, this is what you're getting, a monthly mail out that's going to last 28 months or whatever it was, 28 issues, and it's going to include this, it's going to look like this, and it's going to cost you $3,000, right? Now it's ridiculous, but we can at least be upfront. Part of the reason the Dewline fizzled and failed was because I don't think it met it was a bit of a case of overselling, under delivering. It was overly ambitious, and McLuhan was too busy really at the time to fulfill it. And also the audience, I don't think was ready for it. They just business people don't tend to want to work for answers. They just want the answers. And, So I think there were a lot of things that contributed to its ultimate failure, but it remains a fascinating artifact that maybe this is the time to resurface it.
It might be, um, it always seemed to me that that the Do Line was an inspiration for the early iteration of Wired magazine. So anyway, a few more questions about Marshall, because then we need to talk about you, the institute, etc. All right.
Okay.
So I had the honor of meeting your father, and we had a few lovely conversations. He was very kind to me, and for someone who doesn't know the entire family's output, there was a mystical or theological set of implications that came into your grandfather's later work that at the time when I first met you, I was like, yeah, I don't think I'm going to go there. Now I'm really into it.
Wow. Cool.
Your and your father seems to me to have picked up that ball and have ran with it to some very sophisticated places that in today's day and age where I remember him talking about that. I have not I oh, wait a minute. Okay, so here's the deal. When we're done with this interview, I'm going to tell you about me. He gave me a copy and I got halfway through reading it and then I kind of went crazy and I never reclaimed my personal possessions again. But
Well,
oh,
I'm
it's
happy to
it's fine.
learn that this is published this year through Assembly Press and McLuhan Institute Books, which is look at that little picture of Marshall and Eric.
So you have your own imprint now.
Yeah.
Excellent. Where can people find that?
I mean, Assembly Press is actually headquartered in Picton, Ontario, Canada, but they serve the world through the web, of course. So online.
I wrote an ad. So, are you familiar with Dr. Saryamari Walker?
I'm not.
So, she's an astrophysicist and astrobiologist who has cultivated a provocative new theory of life because one of the problems or omissions in biology is that there's an assumption about what constitutes life and consciousness. She does not skip over that. It's the focus of her work.
Awesome.
I won't attempt to misrepresent her theory as to what constitutes consciousness and life, but I will say that it completely kicks out of the equation whether or not something is organic as we currently know it. It doesn't matter.
Interesting.
And her theory is called assembly theory. So that's an interesting synchronicity.
Oh,
But could you
are you?
please talk to us about your let's just say your family's uh, approach to media, to technology, and to language, incorporating mystical or theological thought.
Wow. Um, well, that's
Sneak preview it at least.
okay.
Let people know what's out there, and then maybe if you'd like, we can come back for a second in depth just on that.
Well, let's see how to get into that.
Do you want me to cut this part out and we'll just do it some other time? It seems like a big thing to ask.
No, that's okay.
All right.
It is a big thing to ask. Um, and um, the difficulty, um, and the wonderful thing about my family's work is that there's so much to it. Um, and I I'm highly skeptical of anybody who claims to be much of an expert in it, because it's so broad and deep. I myself have only really been paying very much attention to it for the last decade or so, and I've only scratched the surface. And frankly, I've cherry picked bits and pieces which have reflected my interests at the time, or have maybe been um, easier. one of the more difficult parts to approach, which maybe you kind of hinted at this in your engagement of Dad's book, is this aspect of religion. Um, it's tricky, it's challenging, and it can be uncomfortable. You know, um, it requires quite a bit of humility and vulnerability and honesty. And you know, these things are not always easy, but it is the religious or spiritual dimension to the work is it's undeniable, it's important, it's also not exactly deterministic. There are people who will say that you can't separate the Catholicism from McLuhan and the media studies, that they're the one informs the other and taints the other, is kind of the implication. Um, I don't think I think that's true, and it's not true. Um, eh, knowing my father as one of the most deeply religious people I've ever known, um, it definitely it's a huge part of who he was, his identity, um, and you can't separate that necessarily from his work. The same goes with Marshall McLuhan. He was raised Protestant and converted to Catholicism, essentially when challenged by people around him when he was at Cambridge University. They, uh, he was talking a lot about G.K. Chesterton and stuff, and they said, "Well, if you think so much about these Catholics, why aren't you Catholic?" And Marshall said, "Huh, that's a good question. Why am I not Catholic?" And my understanding is that he came to the decision that either Catholicism is true, it is what it claims, or it's bullshit and it's the biggest hoax perpetrated on humanity of all time. And he decided, and this actually speaks a lot to his character and his method. He decided that the only way to come to a reasonable conclusion about it was to test it on its own merits. And that meant prayer. Uh, so, as I was told by my father, he essentially got down on his knees and prayed to God for signs. Show me that you're real. Show me it's not a load of crap. Uh, and although my dad never gave me details, particulars, he told me that Marshall McLuhan received so many signs that he could not ignore for such a period of time that he converted to Catholicism. And my father was a big one for signs as well. Um, it's a it's a big comfort to me in my father's last days on earth. Um, I don't know if you know about this, but he died while we were together in Bogota in Colombia, and he was giving a talk at the Universidad de la Sabana. And he had a thing about Mary, the mother of Jesus, and he had a thing about the Saint Teresa, who they called the Little Flower, a modern saint. And uh, the sign of Saint Teresa is roses, and actually the national flower of Colombia is the rose. And my dad, whenever he saw roses, he took that as a sign that Saint Teresa was around and watching. And in fact, in the last entries of his journal, because he was in the habit of writing a journal, he would write in the morning about the previous day's activities. And the last entry of his journal mentions that when we went down for breakfast, all the tables had arrangements of roses on them. And he said Saint Teresa is in the house, you know? And this is, I get emotional talking about it. Uh, but this to me is a comfort because um, he felt her presence, God's presence in his life. And I imagine that was comforting to him in his last moments when he was otherwise alone in a hotel room having a medical emergency and dying. I was out at a museum, and so the religious dimension is inseparable from my father's and my grandfather's life, but it is not a reason to discount their work because because um, their work is predicated on uh, some amount of objectivity. But not only that, from an understanding, I have a copy of Understanding Media, which Marshall put notes in. And on the first page is written, understanding is not a point of view, meaning that that understanding or, a full awareness of something is an accumulation of points of view. It's a multifaceted thing. Um, interpretation happens on many levels. Biblical interpretation, even there are four traditional levels of exegesis: the literal perspective, the moral perspective, the anagogical, mystical perspective. These are all perspectives which put together lead to a full interpretation. So the religious dimension of their life is important. It's not the only dimension of their life and work, and not a reason, only an excuse to dismiss their work, not really a justification or a valid reason, I feel.
Well, in addition to this talk show, I also have a podcast. The podcast is more frequent, and it's my weekly check-ins with my actual friends. One of my friend, the Reverend Douglas C. Moore of Laidlaw United Memorial Church here in Hamilton, often talks to me about the it's the United Church, so it's Protestant. But we've often spoken about the dreary literalism that is an occupational hazard when operating within a Protestant context. That the translations that we have are really not that fantastic. Is the same thing? Is the same thing saying there? The conversation is also that when you have those four different levels of interpretation, you get this very pulp fiction-y, comic booky, soap operatic entertainment value from the Bible.
You
And
could
I wonder
call it
if part of your
fiction if you were feeling perverse. You could call it pulpit fiction if were feeling particularly perverse.
I like that, and I wonder if part of your grandfather's migration from Protestantism to Catholicism is that in its nonverbal dependency, it allowed for a more mosaic-like interpretation of things, a way of looking at the world. And I'll also say that in as a result of the wonderful guests with whom I've had the privilege of speaking, scholars, a lot of comedians, so on and so forth. It seems to me, and I'll gladly share my theological and religious views, but I don't think they're really relevant to what I'm about to say. Something so interesting objectively is happening in the world right now. We have priests of scientists, technologists, and engineers murmuring to each other like priests, and with very, very strange goals like transhumanism um, that have no real utility for working class or poor people, and that to me seem like you know if you look at the story of Atlantis or any of the ancient civilizations that have stories of past civilizations being wiped off the face of the earth, it's always this outstripping of spirituality by technology. The impression I get is that a lot of Jesuit scholars, a lot of Catholic scholars, focusing on everything from quantum mechanics to unexplained anomalous phenomena, formerly known as UFOs, evolution, neurology, immunology. There's the it's strange because when I was a kid, religious people seemed in general off their rocker and closed off from the real world. And now it seems to me like so many of the most interesting podcasters, scholars, artists, um, are coming from, if not a theological belief, then at least a place of deep theological study.
You know, I've noticed there's been a surge in the acceptability of talking about religion in public. Maybe that's just the company I keep, but I've noticed this more and more. Um, uh, Catholicism. Hmm, I have an interesting relationship here because my wife is Protestant. She was raised Baptist, and remains Baptist and goes to church most weeks. And I go with her from not every week, but time to time, out of interest, because it's so foreign being raised Catholic. Um, you know, the way they do things. And there's so many, what a weird time to be Christian, really, technologically. Um, there's, there's so much to talk about here that it seems a lot of Christians seem curiously unaware of the role of technology to their religion. Um, the Bible,
It's strange, isn't it?
the Bible, for example, which is the foundation of uh, of Christianity, I think you could argue a huge part of it anyway. Um, the Bible, which for so many years, you know, was the first great artifact of the printing press. Um, you know, the printing press, which arguably led to Protestantism in the first place and the
Absolutely.
downfall of the church. To me, there's such a curious lack of awareness on the part of these institutions of the role of technology in the creation of these institutions and what the impact might be when you leave the book behind. You know, uh, they have seemingly no awareness of this or appreciation of it, of the consequences. Like,
Andrew,
yeah,
Andrew, recording was stopped on my side by mistake for about 30 seconds.
okay.
So could you please rewind?
It's still going here, but yeah, to rewind, so you should be okay. But to rewind, this notion, for just one example, the relationship of Christians to the Bible. I was at a Protestant service this summer, and the pastor was talking about, oh, whatever book it was, John, and said, you know, people were looking at John 1 chapter, blah blah blah. You know, get out your Bible if you want to follow along. And 99% of the people pulled out their phones, right? Eh, and this this almost dumbfounded me. For one thing, previous to the phone, the screen and projector had supplanted the cross. I don't think people have an awareness of what they did, but you know, they put these giant screens behind people and projected the Bible verse and whatever else onto that, not understanding or thinking that there might be an impact. They put the Bible on the phone and bring the phone everywhere, not thinking that maybe there's a difference between that and a Bible. Um, But all they have to do is look at the Reformation to understand the huge significance of the change in form and what it can mean for the church. Um, because the word, uh, as a poet and somebody interested in words, I pay a lot of attention to the different forms of word. And, one of the biggest revolutions in humanity happened when we made language visible, when we create
Yes.
visual language, the written word. The the culture of the spoken word and the culture of the written word are almost different species. And there's a wonderful study, Eric Havelock. The book I recommend most after any McLuhan book is Eric Havelock's Preface to Plato. And Havelock here in the early, it was I think 62, speaks about or writes about, as the case may be, the life of the Greek people before phonetic literacy, before the alphabet, before written language, how the poets reigned supreme, the mode of culture when the main method of communication is from mouth to ear. And that is how knowledge is passed down, not just in contemporary, but through generations. The Those conditions which make certain culture possible and certain culture less possible, and what happens to that culture when you introduce the written word. And for example, Homer's Odyssey is an oral epic, and this poem is hundreds of printed pages long, takes hours and hours and hours to recite. And yet, apparently, to hear it once was to be able to recite it later. This is the result of thousands and thousands and years of human cognitive development, which was lost very, very quickly, and to the point now where I'll give my students this assignment: compose a poem orally. You cannot write it down or record it in any way. And in order for it to count, you have to be able to recite it the next day. Most people can't do it, period. But when they can, it's the equivalent of a couple of lines. And you realize very quickly that rhyme and meter are technologies. They're human innovations in order to facilitate the recording and transmission of information, not just aesthetic uses, but technical uses. The point I'm making here is that it makes every difference whether your culture is transmitted orally or through print or through the screen. And you say goodbye to culture and hello to culture when you change forms in this major way. Um, and the point I'm trying to make is that these churches, who should have a very strong awareness of this, given it's the foundation of their church, seem to have zero awareness of this in embracing things like not only Bible apps, but now I was at another Protestant service recently, and the guy opens a discussion on love by saying, I asked Chat GPT to tell me about love. And it's like, wow. Zero awareness of what they're potentially doing, essentially shooting themselves in the foot or other places. So anyway, religion and technology are very closely related things the more you look in.
Very closely.
In fact, I wrote an essay. I don't know if you came across this. I was commissioned by the Templeton Foundation to write about technology and religion. And I put out a few meditations about it, including considering prayer as technology, um, which to me is fascinating and possibly a very early human religious technology. It came from this 17th century poem by George Herbert on prayer, a short poem where he describes prayer as reverse thunder. which is the notion that ancient peoples felt that thunder was the god speaking to humans. So that prayer is a kind of reverse thunder where humans can speak to the gods. And that got me to thinking about the notion of prayer as a technology, as a human innovation. And that to me is a fascinating subject.
How can I and how can others access these Templeton essays?
Um, I mean, it's the John Templeton Foundation. I think it's templeton.org. Um, and I don't even recall the title of my essay at this point, but if you search for Templeton McLuhan, you'll probably come up with it.
All right. So I want to talk about institutions that disappoint us and institutions that delight us.
Okay.
And let's kick off this conversation with um, with the ever disappointing University of Toronto.
Wow. Okay. What do you think there?
Well, look, when you and I were in more frequent contact, I don't think that I ever articulated this out of a desire to be respectful, but I was never really impressed. In fact, I was kind of like, is there something wrong with me? Because this new head seems like an idiot. Um, I might have to edit that out. Um, no, no, I mean, I was impressed by you. And of course, I was impressed by your grandfather's work and then your father when I met him. But I just didn't get a sense that any of the events that I went to, any of the website pages that I read, any of the announcements about papers or essays or university or conference presentations, it was like,
Okay.
so yeah, okay, I'm definitely editing this out. So why don't you, we'll just make it all about you because no one needs to hear what I think about this. So what what's the deal? Like your grandfather dies and the University of Toronto does what and what's the evolution?
Okay. Well, I hope you won't edit that out because I think that's a valid and important perspective. I also
Anything for you, Andrew.
well,
So I'll keep it in.
I also um I've learned as I get older to try and be generous and charitable. I think it doesn't cost us too much. And I've also learned that most people um are genuinely uh not jerks a lot of the time and are sincerely trying to do similar things that I am, pursuing their interests and not trying necessarily to be dicks about it. Um, but here's the thing. I also have to be, somewhat political because whatever. Bullshit. I also believe in speaking my mind and giving my honest opinion. And here's the thing. This is a longer conversation than we have time for, but I'll give the rundown. McLuhan worked for the University of Toronto, St. Michael's College, from 1946. He died in 1980, on New Year's Eve 1980. Actually, in the chronology of events, we already talked about the Fordham year. Just before Fordham, Marshall founded the Center for Culture and Technology. And when he returned from Fordham, he was given this coach house, this building uh, tucked in behind the Center for Medieval Studies, behind St. Joseph Street and what's now, it's still called St. Joseph, but there's a little subtitle on top that calls it Marshall McLuhan Way. Anyway, it's tucked in behind there, which kind of speaks volumes. Uh, you know, Harold Innis has a college, and McLuhan gets tucked away. And I'm not upset about it. Actually, I find it hilarious. I used to be upset about it, but I find it funny and transparent. Um, and such a lost opportunity because you know what? People come to the University of Toronto to find McLuhan, and scratch their heads wondering why they don't. What's up with that? It's it's curious. And again, it's a complicated discussion that goes into politics and attitudes and conservatism and knowledge and siloed knowledge and all this kind of stuff. But Marshall was given this building, a 2-story former coach house to run his center from, and he did. People like John Lennon and Yoko Ono, the Prime Minister of Canada, international luminaries came and found him and visited him there in this humble coach house at the University of Toronto. And when Marshall McLuhan had a stroke in the fall of 1979, the university forced him at age, I guess, 68 into an early retirement and closed the Center for Culture and Technology temporarily, they said, um, saying that when he gets back on his feet and regains his powers of speech, he's welcome to come back, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that was genuine. By that time, the people who were in his corner had left, notably Claude Bissell, who was president for quite a while and was McLuhan's champion. Um, it's also very important to note that McLuhan chose to stay at the University of Toronto. When he came back from Fordham, he'd received lots of offers. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that he could have worked at almost any top university in the world if he chose to, but he wanted to stay at the University of Toronto, and it's worthwhile asking why. The why is both a positive and not so positive thing for Toronto and the university. Basically, he recognized that he would be left alone to a large part, ignored. And being ignored meant that he could get more work done than if he had a constant parade of people and stuff like this. I think that was a large part of it. But he didn't have a lot of friends there, and they were very, very happy to close the center. And I'm kind of a lot of the things I'm saying are my impressions, and I obviously don't know what people were thinking and why they did what they did. When the Center for Culture and Technology was closed, it reopened in the mid 1980s under not St. Michael's College, but under the Faculty of Information, now called the iSchool, where it is today. And the iSchool, in their wisdom, chose a director who I think is the person you're referring to, who decided to take it in a feminist, queer studies, whatever kind of direction. This pisses off a lot of people, particularly and ironically, the very conservative McLuhan crowd, the old-time hardliners who have ideas about what McLuhan is and what it's not. For me, two things. For me, I don't care if you don't like Marshall McLuhan, ERiC McLUHAN, me, the family's work. Really, I don't. If you don't find it interesting or useful, apt or salient, as the current director called it, that's fine by me. I happen to, and if you want to do something else, by all means, go for it. The other point to make is Marshall McLuhan considered himself an explorer. He said, "I don't explain, I explore." And he considered himself an explorer, a safecracker, all these kinds of things. Somebody who was investigating unknown territory. And when you're an explorer and you're on a frontier, there are no wrong directions. An avenue of investigation is as valid as another. So if you want to try and take McLuhan's studies into feminism and gender studies, queer studies, Marxist studies, that's not necessarily a bad thing as far as I'm concerned. I don't.
No,
I
it's not,
think
but you have to understand, understand the core ideas.
yeah. Well, you know, so there came to a point with the most recent director And this is not gossip. It's what happened, where the most recent director, this guy from film studies, put out a statement saying, and this was, I guess, 2 years ago now, that the programming for this year does not presume that McLuhan's style of investigation, or however he worded it, what is particularly apt or salient, nor that it was at the time. Which is a crazy thing for the director of something called the McLuhan Center to say. Hugely disrespectful. And it led to a series of events that resulted in the removal of the McLuhan name from the center. And people, I'm following it on Twitter, and you can too. People said, "Oh, McLuhan takes his ball and goes home," and it's very ignorant of actually the situation. And speaking of projects, I have a lot of materials from around the time when the center was closed, and there's a story to be told about that whole thing, and university
What year?
life in general. What year? What?
What year
For what?
is this happening?
Oh, this is recent. Um, so that now it's just the Center for Culture and Technology. If you go to the website, it shows a line drawing of the building, and when people go there now looking for McLuhan, they don't find him, and that's a shame, and I think of a very much missed opportunity on the university's part. And it frankly, and again, this is my opinion, my perspective, but a situation of their own making, that I wish were not the case. But it is precisely because of this that I did not go to university to get a doctorate to try and become the director of the center. I realized how futile that would be. Instead, I started the McLuhan Institute, and that way I have control over what that is. And my mom's telling me that we're running into the last 10 minutes of what I can do with you, so maybe we should move on to a summary now that we've gotten that out of our system.
Well, okay, so I'm going to mention for our listeners and viewers that this is the same university in the same decade as the international scandals related to Jordan Peterson. And perhaps there's something to be said for the idea that we may be nostalgic in terms of in what we believe universities to be capable of. And maybe this is all for the best, because these non-institutional, more entrepreneurial initiatives such as yours are in such a cross-networked, corporatized world. And in corporatized, I include universities, at least major research universities. It gives you an opportunity to flourish. Why don't you end with talking about the Institute and what you guys are doing and how people can get involved?
Yeah, okay. And Peterson is an interesting case. Um, doesn't seem to be particularly versed in McLuhan, although he's mentioned him once or twice publicly. But he certainly caught the public's imagination, and again, I think it's a very serious miscalculation on the university's part to alienate him when he could have done wonderful things for their enrollment. Instead, people followed him elsewhere when he was forced out. But yeah, it's I approach this as a almost failed high school student. I did graduate, but it took an extra year. I come at this work not from the academic way that my father and grandfather did, but from a poetic and maybe normal kind of person way. And I think while this may be, and the funny thing is, I used to think that I would need a PhD in order to teach in universities, when in fact, I give lectures at universities all the time, and nobody has ever asked for my credentials. But the Toronto thing is funny because this past week, I gave a lecture at OCAD, the Ontario College of Art and Design, and it was the first time I've been invited to lecture in Toronto, uh, which is hilarious because for the last 10 years, I've been traveling the world physically and virtually doing just that. So, you know, when I was in Toronto this week, a guy asked me after, he said, would you be willing to fund a McLuhan Center in Toronto since there isn't one? And I said, it's this funny misapprehension that people assume that our family has any money. Uh, it's a great irony and not necessarily a bad thing, but an irony that I was left with an incredible intellectual legacy and with zero financial legacy really to make anything of it. That's meant that I've had to do it myself, which is fine. You mentioned punk rock, and I come from a punk rock background, so DIY is in my blood as well, and that's fine. But it also means that I don't have the easy resources that come with affiliation with a major institution. It also means that I don't have the liabilities of the major institution, the politics, the nasty stuff, the bullshit that all goes along with it. So, the pros and cons. But really, the most important thing to me about the McLuhan Institute is its independence, which gives me the freedom to decide what McLuhan tradition means and to put out my version of it into the world. Um, the the very important thing I need to do next is to make very, very clear what that is, because I recognize that, like my grandfather and father, I'm not going to be around forever. And things need to be in place for the next person to take it on. And that isn't necessarily going to be somebody from the family. I'm not pushing my sons to be into it. It could be you. Who knows who it could be? Um, but if something keeps me up at night a little bit, it's the knowledge that I ask myself, if I were to die today, tomorrow, have I left things in a state that somebody can come in and take over and continue as I would want them to? And the answer is no. So that is on my mind and something I need to to figure out. But uh, I also have to figure out how to make this thing run and be sustainable for the next generation. So that's also top of mind. If people want to support me, find out what I'm doing, the McLuhanInstitute.com is not an amazing website, but you can email me, Andrew at the McLuhanInstitute.com. I run the McLuhan newsletter on Substack, which you can join as a paid subscriber, or you can enjoy all the content, zero paywalls as a free subscriber. I don't believe in paywalls. I think this work is, you know, I treat it as a human service, even though it's only funded by the work that I do, writing and consulting and teaching and whatever. So, if you want to hire me to come give a talk or do some mentorship or consulting, by all means. Uh, but yeah, you can support me by doing that. Check out this book, The Sensus Communis, Synesthesia, and the Soul, ERiC McLuhan's last published work, which is very important and maybe the subject of another discussion. But thanks for.
Would you come back?
Yeah, of course. And it's
All
great
right.
to reconnect with you, Sean, and hi to your audience.
Well, hello and goodbye, everybody. This is Andrew McLuhan. His website is themcluhaninstitute.com. His X handle is.
Well, I have the McLuhan Institute on X, but Amicus ad Astra is the personal one where I get a little spicy with words.
He is. So, ladies and gentlemen, his two X accounts are my personal favorite. I'm not just saying that. He is a wonderful writer who is easy to understand, but at the same time, so complex and delicious in his thought. Thank you so much.
Tell me more, Sean.
Well, I'm going to tell you more. I'm going to, like, for everyone else. Bye, everybody. So we're ending it here, but I want to talk to you for 5 more minutes.